5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy New Year, everyone! Hey, Dr. McCoy, 2020 is finally over. Well, we finally made it, and it's time to say sayonara, good riddance, and kiss my ass to 2020. And what better way to send off a year of horrors than by discussing the best horror of the year. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the best horror books and movies that I read or watched in the year 2020. Now, my rules for this are fairly simple. In order to be included, a movie has to have had a release within the calendar year 2020. A book, on the other hand, I just have to have read within the year 2020. So you'll find some older books amongst this list, as well as some newer ones. You will find only newer films, however. Let's start off by talking about the best movies that I saw in 2020. Now, this year was very strange for me because the theaters were closed, and personally I don't believe in spending theater prices for a home movie experience. I like to either watch the movies in theaters, as I feel movies are supposed to be seen, or buy the DVD if I want to own it as part of my collection, or just rent it as part of one of the streaming services that I subscribe to. I'm not going to spend movie theater prices for a temporary rental, so I have not seen a lot of the newest releases that are only available on video on demand. I have, however, seen several DVD releases and several movies that are original on Shudder, and those will be the ones that are included in my Best of 2020 list. For this year, I have curated a top 5 list, and I figure the best way to manage this is just to count them down, so let's get started. The first film came to my attention right at the very last minute, and that is Z. This came in my December horror pack, so I only just watched it, and it already made it onto my top 5 list. This was originally released in 2019, however, it did have a 2020 release on Blu-ray, and it's also available this year on Shudder if you don't want to buy the Blu-ray. I already read the description of this in my video opening up the December horror pack, so if you want the description off the back, you can go and watch that video. But the short version is that this is a movie about a family that's being haunted by their child's imaginary friend, who turns out to perhaps not be so imaginary after all. It's a fairly standard plot, however it is exquisitely performed by the entire cast, and it has a couple of genuinely creepy moments in there, a couple of actually shocking moments, and overall is just a very well done film. If this were a year in which I had seen hundreds of brand new movies, I don't know this would have made my top list, but in this year, it was a welcome reprieve from a year of horrors. Fans of H.P. Lovecraft will tell you that the author's works are notoriously difficult to adapt to film. Many have tried, and very few have succeeded, so I'm pleasantly surprised to be able to include, coming in at the number 4 position, The Color Out of Space, adapted from the H.P. Lovecraft story and starring Nicolas Cage. In many ways, this is not a great horror film. In fact, in some ways it's actually somewhat mediocre. However, it does boast impressive yet bizarre, very appropriately bizarre, special effects, and the plot is crazy enough that Nicolas Cage's Nicolas Cage-ness is perfectly suited to this film. The result is a film that, though not an exact translation of the H.P. Lovecraft story to the screen, is actually remarkably similar to the story. It follows the story very closely, and is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the more successful H.P. Lovecraft adaptations. I should point out that, though I own the Blu-ray, I believe Color Out of Space is also streaming on Shudder, for those of you who prefer to watch it that way. Also available on Shudder is our number 3 selection, Anything for Jackson. This is a film in which an elderly couple mourning the death of their grandson in a car accident kidnap a woman planning to insert their deceased grandson's spirit into the body of the fetus that the woman is carrying. This is a bizarre story, but it's perfectly performed by the entire cast, particularly those playing the elderly couple, and it manages, even though it's not an entirely original plot, to still have plenty of surprises. One of the things that I often complain about in horror movies is that many writers and directors and authors and filmmakers and horror creators in general struggle to come up with good endings for horror. There are a variety of reasons for this, and it might be the subject of a future video, but the point is, the ending is probably the hardest part to get right in a horror film, and Anything for Jackson manages to actually surprise the viewer with an ending, but is also a satisfying conclusion to the story. For that reason, it comes in at number 3. And the number 2 slot is a film that actually premiered at a film festival in 2019, but did receive its wide release in 2020, and that's good enough for me, and that is The Mortuary Collection, again available on Shudder. Now, The Mortuary Collection is an anthology film featuring several short films bound together by what we might call a frame story, featuring Clancy Brown as Montgomery Dark, the mortician/storyteller and sort of crypt keeper character in the film. In fact, the character of Montgomery Dark is perhaps the best thing about the film, but it also features a number of very well-told stories and very well-made short films. I think that the short form lends itself well to horror filmmaking, and I look forward to seeing more anthology films in the future, but for now, we can content ourselves with our number 2 selection, The Mortuary Collection. Before we proceed with our number 1 film of the year, I have 2 honorable mentions that I want to get out of the way. The first is not a horror film, but a documentary about horror films, and that's In Search of Darkness. This is a documentary about the horror films of the 1980s, again available on Shudder. It's an excellent documentary. It traces the lineage of our favorite genre through an entire decade, and it's well worth watching. Our other honorable mention is the Creepshow Holiday Special. This is about half the length of a feature film, and it tells the story of a man who has reason to suspect that he might be a werewolf, and so he goes to a meeting of Shapeshifters Anonymous. At that meeting, a variety of interesting things happen, building to a fairly outrageous climax, which, while not exactly great cinema, is thoroughly enjoyable to watch, and if you didn't happen to catch it as part of your holiday watching, you might want to give it a watch anyway. All of which brings us to our number 1 horror film of 2020, and that is Shudder's Host. Again, a fairly short film. What sets this one apart is that it takes place specifically during this year, during the quarantine from the earlier half of the year, and it tells the story of a group of friends gathered for a seance over Zoom or a similar video conferencing platform, and things don't go as they planned. What sets this film apart is that it was conceived, filmed, all of the pre-production, production, post-production was all done during this year, during quarantine, remotely, and it manages to be a very good film nonetheless. I don't know that Host will be a classic film because it is so specific to this year, but as a sort of time capsule of how strange and horrifying this year has been, I can't think of a better number 1 selection for the best horror films of the year than Host. And that brings us to the books. Now, I read well over 100 books every year. In fact, this year I read 113 books, most of them horror, and I can't possibly discuss them all. So, again, I have selected a best of for the year. And like I mentioned before, these are not all published in the year 2020. These are books that I read and or reread in 2020. Before I get to the actual best of list, I should mention the sorts of bookends for my horror reading of the year. The first book that I read this year was this book, 12 Nights at Rotter House by J.W. Auker. This is an author I was previously unfamiliar with until I read this book, a tale of 2 horror nerd friends who stay at a haunted house, and of course horrifying things happen. While this did not quite make my best of the year list, it is nevertheless a very good book. It's a sort of self-aware horror story because of all the references the characters talk about. and for that reason it's well worth reading. Even though it didn't quite make my list, the ending didn't quite appeal to me enough to earn the 5-star rating that it would take to be on this list. This nevertheless earned a 4-star rating, which for me is just about as good as it gets. In order to earn those 5-star ratings, a book has to really be not just very good, but sort of transcendent, as you'll see when I get to the list of books that actually did earn the 5-star rating this year. And my final book of the year actually did come out in 2020, at least in this edition, and that is End of the Road by Brian Keene. This is a sort of memoir/history of the horror genre. It was my last book of the year. It was my 113th book of the year. Also very much worth reading, even though this is not a horror novel. This is a nonfiction book about horror, and it's recommended in that spirit. And now let's get to the proper list of my favorite, top, best horror books that I read in the year 2020. These books are presented in no particular order. These are all of the horror or horror-related books that I gave 5-star reviews in 2020. First up is this book, The Good House by Tananarive Due. This is the story of a woman named Angela who returns to her family home, the Good House, a couple of years after her son died there. This is a deep, character-driven story. It's a bit of a slow burn, but while she's there, in addition to dredging up the sort of metaphorical ghosts of the past that comes along with visiting your family home, particularly when a tragic event has happened there, there's also hints that something not quite right is happening, and it gradually builds to something terrifying. It's an excellent book. It does take a little while to get into in terms of the horror, but along the way you're treated to such rich character descriptions that you enjoy the entire journey. This is definitely one of the best books of the year. It is highly recommended, and you really owe it to yourself to read The Good House by Tananarive Due. Next up is Kill Creek by Scott Thomas. Now this is similar in many ways to the aforementioned 12 Nights at Rotterhouse. In both cases, horror nerds visit a haunted house and things go wrong. So there's similar stories in that respect. In this case, it's 4 famous best-selling horror authors who have gathered at a famous haunted house to give an interview which is going to be streamed live over the internet. And of course, things go wrong. Like 12 Nights at Rotterhouse, what I particularly like is the clear love for the horror genre demonstrated by, in fact, both authors. And the characters in this book are very realistic. You will recognize horror authors that you know, even though these are fictional characters. You'll notice the traits are similar. The books are similar to other authors that you will recognize. So this is sort of like a love letter to the horror genre. What makes this one stand apart just a little bit more than 12 Nights at Rotterhouse is that while the ending didn't quite work for me in 12 Nights at Rotterhouse, this book manages to take the kinda sorta cliched haunted house story, and about halfway through the action ramps up and it twists that trope on its head and goes in a completely different direction. It breathes some new life into the horror nerd at haunted house story, and for that reason, while 12 Nights at Rotterhouse is an excellent book and earned my 4-star review, this one managed to get just a slight advantage and earned the 5-star review. Also very highly recommended. My next book is technically not a horror novel. It's a thriller, but it does have many horror elements, and it's clearly written by a horror author. And that book is The Annihilation Protocol by Michael Lawrence. This author is actually known as a horror author under the name Michael McBride, where he writes sorts of monster stories. And though this is not a horror novel, this is a thriller, it doesn't have the monsters that he's known for as Michael McBride. As Michael Lawrence, he nevertheless has the sort of horror author's sensibility and a sense of pacing and tension and drama. So, though a political thriller, this is the horror author's answer to the political thriller, I would say. This is actually the second book in a series. The first book is called The Extinction Agenda. I like both books very much. I actually like this second one slightly better than the first one. Both are excellent political thrillers. I wouldn't actually recommend starting with this one. I would go back and read The Extinction Agenda first. But do pick up both of these, and then go out and pick up the monster novels under the name Michael McBride. All of his work is excellent, and this earns my next 5-star rating, and is well at home even though this is a list primarily of horror novels. Do you ever watch those movies about families of psychotic mass murderers or serial killers and wonder what might it be like to be a member of a family like that? If you've ever had that curiosity, you will love this book, Brother by Anya Alborn. This is a book in which the main character is in fact a member of one of those psycho families of serial killers. But he's not entirely comfortable with that situation, and the horror in this novel comes from the conflict between family and what this main character knows to be right versus wrong. This is also one of those books where my typical complaints about the endings of horror stories does not apply. Aristotle told us that the ending of a story should seem both surprising and inevitable. The ending of this book will catch you completely off guard, and yet, given everything that preceded it, it seems completely inevitable. The entire book is worth reading, and the ending manages to be just as strong as the rest. This is one of the more disturbing books on the list, although not the most disturbing, which is saying something. Nevertheless, a very good book, and very much deserves its place on my best books of the year list. Speaking of disturbing books, probably the most disturbing book on my list this year is also by far the shortest book, and that is this. This is actually a collection of short stories. One is called Left for Dead, and one is called Fall from Grace, both by Kelly Owen. Now let me pause for a moment to say that I will be linking you to where you can purchase these books in the What's It. You'll notice, however, that this book does not have an Amazon link. The reason for that is Amazon actually banned this book from their store. I have many thoughts about this, and I find myself seeing red every time I think about it, but for purposes of this discussion here, suffice it to say I give no quarter to censorship. For that reason alone, I would elevate this maybe a full 1-star rating. However, this already earned the highest possible 5-star rating because it's just that good. It's also incredibly disturbing. These are two related stories. Fall from Grace is a sequel to Left for Dead, and I think Left for Dead is the stronger of the two stories, although both are excellent. Left for Dead in particular, let's just say we can understand why some idiot at Amazon would think to ban this book, even though we don't agree with that sort of decision at all. This is some seriously disturbing stuff, and I don't want to spoil anything by telling you what it's actually about. In fact, I recommend you don't even read the description on the back of the book or the description on the website. You should know as little as possible about this book going in, except that it will completely tear you apart. It's disturbing, heartbreaking, like every negative emotion crammed into just a few short pages, and it's brilliantly written. This is an excellent book. And as you can see, both stories together are only a few pages long. You could read this in a single sitting. It's the kind of book that if you have the stomach for it, you might go back and reread time and again because it's just that good. But most people probably won't have the stomach for it because it's also just that disturbing. Speaking of Kelly Owen, the same author is also on my list for these books, Waiting Out Winter and The Hatch. The Hatch is actually the sequel to Waiting Out Winter, and I need to discuss why I'm recommending both books. To begin with, Waiting Out Winter is the story of a plague, appropriate to this year. This particular plague is carried by insects, and this is a sort of apocalyptic plague story, much like you'd expect, although very well written with realistic characters. It's a nice short book, and I gave this one actually a 4-star review. The reason that these are on my list is the sequel, The Hatch, which I'm not going to spoil too much except to say that it's a direct follow-up to Waiting Out Winter. This is what happens next in the story. I'm not going to tell you exactly where Waiting Out Winter left off or where this one picks up because that's for you to discover on your own. This one is actually even better than the first book. They're both good, but this one manages to just sort of eke out a little bit of an advantage. This earned my 5-star rating. But because you really don't want to read this one without having read this one, I'm putting both on the list, even though it's The Hatch that's earning my best of the year rating. This is the very good, not quite as good lead-in to a book that earned its place on the best of list. Next up is a book that I first read when it came out in 2018, and I reread this year, and that is Hole in the World by Brian Keene. I have a bit of a personal connection to this particular book. Several years back, Brian Keene sold, in very limited quantities, the right to be a character in one of his books, and this is that book. And I was one of those people who bought the right to be a character, so I am actually a character in this book. And as such, I'm not really comfortable giving it a full, proper review. However, I am still comfortable giving it a rating, partially for personal reasons, but also based on the quality of the story and the quality of the writing, etc., etc. I do give this a 5-star rating. It's a very good story, and has a special place in my heart because of my personal connection to the story. This is the limited edition hardcover, which I don't think you're even going to find a used copy of anymore, but there are other options available for purchase. And so if you want to see whether I would survive or die a horrible, miserable death in a sort of prehistoric world, you can get a copy of Brian Keene's Hole in the World. Next up is a book of poetry. That is Dragonfly and Other Songs of Mourning by Michelle Scalise, who was the wife of the late great horror writer Tom Piccirilli, and a well-established author of primarily ghost fiction in her own right. I mentioned the author's husband, Tom Piccirilli, not to downplay the importance of Michelle Scalise's own work, but because these poems are specifically poems of mourning. Very unfortunately, Tom Piccirilli passed away a couple of years ago. I didn't know him well, but I was acquainted with him, and of course, I've lost people in my own life, and so I do have some sense of what the author is talking about in these poems. This is not my usual style of poetry. I usually prefer a much more formal verse, whereas these are more free verse poems. But the language in these poems and the subject matter is so rich and so deep and so heavy, even though this is just a tiny, short book of poems, it nevertheless earns an enthusiastic 5-star rating. This is another one of those books that, though not disturbing like some of the others, this book will nevertheless rip your heart out because these are such heartfelt poems. And it's not just that thoughts and writings and poems about loss and death and mourning are horrific in their own right, although they are, but you can definitely detect horror elements in much of the imagery in some of these poems. Very good for horror fans, very good in general. If you like poetry at all, or even if you're just looking for a good introduction to poetry, this would be a really good book to add to your collection. Next up, and closing out our discussion of the extreme, very disturbing horror novels, is The Resurrectionist by Rath James White. This is now a classic of the extreme horror genre. Rath is known for extreme horror. He's very good at it. And this book is certainly no exception. It's one of the most disturbing things I've read all year, and also one of the best things I've read all year, earning its 5-star rating. Now, what to say about this book? This is a book that opens with one of the most disturbing scenes of violence that many people will have ever read, and then it just gets more disturbing and darker as it goes along. However, and key for my giving it a 5-star rating, is that this isn't just disturbing for the sake of being disturbing. This book also touches on issues of theology, psychology, philosophy, criminal justice, very deep topics of conversation. All of that is in here, along with all of the brutal violence that makes it one of the most disturbing books, and one of the best books that I read this year, even though it came out several years ago. Next up is a recent book and a winner of the prestigious Bram Stoker Award, and that is The Bone Weaver's Orchard by Sarah Reed. I mentioned that this book won the Bram Stoker Award, and deservedly so. This is the story of a young boy at a school for boys, which can be a horrifying enough situation, and in fact it is for this particular character, but it's made even more horrifying by the appearance of a sort of monstrous figure wandering the hallways. Admittedly, the description sounds fairly standard, and parts of the book certainly are fairly standard, but nevertheless, this is an incredibly deep character study, has some genuinely frightening moments, and is an all-around excellent book. Next up is a book you've already heard me discuss. That is Calling the Spirits, A History of Seances by Elisa Morton. I mentioned in my video review of this book that it was one of my rare 5-star books. It still is. I will refer you to my video for a more detailed description and review. For here, suffice it to say that this is an excellent and very, very, very informative history of seances. While this is non-fiction rather than a horror novel, of course, seances go hand in hand with the horror genre, so this book has a well-deserved place on my best horror of the year list. And last, but certainly not least, as I mentioned, these are in no particular order, is Resurrecting Ravana. This is a Buffy the Vampire Slayer tie-in novel by Ray Garton. Now, anyone who knows me knows I am a big fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I consider it one of the greatest television programs ever made. I think it's remarkable that it manages to, on the one hand, seem sort of timeless, and on the other hand, seem like a sort of time capsule of its particular late 90s, early 2000s setting. This book, set during the show's 3rd season, manages to capture those same timeless and time-specific qualities. Of course, it features the usual Buffy cast of characters facing the kind of monster that they usually face in the show, although the monster here is entirely original to the novel. For me, this represents a sort of going home, a return to familiar faces. And while I would have given this a 5-star review anyway, that was just what the doctor ordered this year when everything is so unusual. I felt like going back to these characters that I have known and loved for so many years was a welcome break. And I think that though, God willing, things are going to be better in 2021 than they were in 2020, a lot of us still need a break for a while, and if you like Buffy and you want to return and see some of those characters again, this book, Resurrecting Ravana, is a perfect place to start if you're interested in the Buffy tie-ins and if you haven't tried those before. And that does it. That is my list of best horror books and movies of the year 2020. Of course, there are many, many, many that I did not discuss that are nevertheless very good. I've mentioned before that, in my mind, a 4-star review is a very good review, and that's a highly recommended book, that I only give 5-star reviews to the perfect or near-perfect books. There were many 4-star horror novels and 4-star horror movies this year. They just didn't happen to make this list because I have a small stack of 5-star reviews. If you're interested in more recommendations, of course, be sure to subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. I do these kinds of lists somewhat regularly. I do reviews from time to time, so I always have some new recommendation for you to consider. In the meantime, I hope you'll join me in saying kiss my ass to 2020 and welcoming 2021. I know that things may not be better immediately. They almost certainly will not be. However, we do now have 2 vaccines that are now being administered to patients. In fact, if you're interested in vaccines, my friend and fellow magician Tyler has received one of the vaccines and is chronicling his experiences on his own YouTube channel, which I will link down in the What's It. All of which is just to say that though the horrors of 2020 are assuredly going to spill into 2021, I am optimistic that 2021 will nevertheless be a better year, and in that spirit I say, welcome to 2021. I hope you'll stick around and keep watching this channel throughout the year and years to come. I do have some exciting things planned. In the meantime, take care and stay scared.